Today's topic will be cost allocation and activity-based costing. This is Carol Ace Ramos, your reporter for today for the subject MBA 112A. These are the objectives of my presentation. Identify the three methods of allocating factory overhead to product cost. Use single plant-wide factory overhead rate for product costing. Use multiple plant-wide factory overhead rate for product costing. And use activity-based costing for product costing, also in selling and administrative expenses and service businesses.
Product costing is determining the cost of a product. Product cost consists of direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead. The direct materials and direct labor are direct costs that can be traced to the product. However, factory overhead includes indirect costs that must be allocated to the product.
That is why factory overhead can be allocated using a predetermined factory overhead rate. The most common methods of allocating factory overhead using predetermined factory overhead rates are single plant-wide rate method, multiple production department rate method, and activity-based costing method. Single plant-wide rate method is wherein factory overhead costs are allocated to products using only one rate. Meanwhile, multiple production department rate method requires identifying the factory overhead by each production department. And lastly, activity-based costing method is wherein activity-based costing requires factory overhead to be budgeted to activities. First up is the single plant-wide factory overhead rate method. A company may use a predetermined factory overhead rate to allocate factory overhead costs to products. Under the single plant-wide factory overhead rate method, factory overhead costs are allocated to products using only one rate. We can use this formula to determine our single plant-wide factory overhead rate by using the total budgeted factory overhead over the total budgeted plant-wide allocation base. The budgeted allocation base is a measure of operating activity in the factory. Common allocation bases would include direct labor hours, direct labor dollars, and machine hours.
Let us now go to our sample illustration for the Ruiz Company. Ruiz Company manufactures snowmobiles and riding mowers in a single factory. Its total budgeted factory overhead cost for the year is 1.6 million, and its total budgeted direct labor hours is 20,000 hours. The total budgeted direct labor hours are computed as follows. For snowmobiles and riding mowers, there are 1,000 units each planned for production for the year. And for each snowmobile and riding mower, there are 10 hours direct labor hours per unit, with a total of 10,000 hours for snowmobile and riding mowers, another 10,000 hours with a total of 20,000 hours budgeted direct labor hours. Ruiz allocates factory overhead using budgeted direct labor hours as the plant-wide allocation base. We can now compute for the single plant-wide factory overhead rate by using the total budgeted overhead cost amounting to $1.6 million divided by the total budgeted direct labor hours amounting to 20,000 direct labor hours for a total of $80 per direct labor hour. Ruiz uses the plant-wide rate of $80 per direct labor hour to allocate factory overhead to snowmobiles and riding mowers. This is computed as follows. Snowmobile, $80 per direct labor hour multiplied by 10 direct labor hours with a total factory overhead cost per unit of $800. Same with riding mower, $80 per direct labor hour multiplied by 10 direct labor hours with a total factory overhead cost per unit of $800.
The factory overhead allocated to each product is $800. This is because each product uses the same number of direct labor hours. The primary advantage of using the single plant-wide overhead rate method is that it is simple and inexpensive to use. However, the single plant-wide rate assumes that the factory overhead costs are consumed in the same way by all products. Next up is the multiple production department factory overhead rate method. When production departments differ significantly in their manufacturing processes, factory overhead costs are normally incurred differently in each department. In such cases, factory overhead costs may be more accurately allocated using multiple production department factory overhead rates. The multiple production department factory overhead rate method uses different rates for each production department to allocate factory overhead costs to products. In contrast, the single plant-wide rate method that uses only one rate to allocate factory overhead costs. We can use this formula to calculate for the production department factory overhead rate. We can use the budgeted department factory overhead divided by the budgeted department allocation base. To illustrate the multiple production department factory overhead rate method, the prior illustration for Ruiz Company will be used. Let us assume that Ruiz uses the following two production departments in the manufacture of snowmobiles and riding mowers. Fabrication department, which cuts metal to the shape of the product, and assembly department, which manually assembles machine pieces into a final product. The total budgeted factory overhead for Ruiz is 1.6 million divided into the fabrication and assembly departments as follows. For fabrication department amounts to $1,030,000 and assembly department amounts to $570,000 with a total budgeted factory overhead cost of $1.6 million. As illustrated, the fabrication department incurs nearly twice the factory overhead of the assembly department. This is because the fabrication department has more machinery and equipment that uses more power and incurs more equipment depreciation and uses more factory supplies. We can now compute for the production department factory overhead rate. Let us assume that Ruiz Company uses direct labor hours as the allocation base for the fabrication and assembly departments. Each department uses 10,000 direct labor hours. For fabrication department factory overhead rate, we can now compute for the total overhead cost amounting to $1,030,000 divided by 10,000 direct labor hours is equals to $103 per direct labor hours, while for assembly department factory overhead rate, a total of $570,000 overhead cost divided by 10,000 direct labor hours is equals to $57 per direct labor hours. 10 direct labor hours are required for the manufacture of each snowmobile and riding mower. These 10 labor hours are consumed in fabrication and assembly department as follows. For fabrication department, snowmobiles needs 8 hours, while riding mower needs 2 hours. While assembly department needs 2 hours for snowmobile and 8 hours for riding mower, for a total of 10 hours for snowmobile and 10 hours for riding mower. Let us now move on to the allocation of factory overhead costs to each product. Each snowmobile is allocated $938 of total factory overhead cost, while each riding mower is allocated $662 of factory overhead cost. This summarizes the multiple production department rate allocation method for Ruiz. This indicates that the fabrication department factory overhead rate is $103 per direct labor hour, while the assembly department rate is $57 per direct labor hour. Since the snowmobile uses more fabrication department direct labor hour than does the riding mower, the total overhead allocated to each snowmobile is 276 greater than the amount allocated to each riding mower. The single plant-wide factory overhead rate distorts product cost by averaging high and low factory overhead cost. This can be seen through the differences in the factory overhead cost per unit through the single plant-wide method and the multiple production department method. The single plant-wide factory overhead rate distorts the product cost of both the snowmobile and riding mower. That is, the snowmobile is not allocated enough cost and thus is undercosted by $138. In contrast, the riding mower is allocated too much and is overcosted by $138. The preceding cost distortions are caused by averaging the differences between the high factory overhead cost in the fabrication department and the low factory overhead cost in the assembly department. Using the single plant-wide rate, it is assumed that all factory overhead is directly related to a single allocation base for the entire plant. This assumption is not realistic for Ruiz. Thus, using a single plant-wide rate distorted the product cost of snowmobiles and riding mowers. The following conditions indicate that a single plant-wide factory overhead rate may cause product cost distortions. Condition 1. Differences in production department factory overhead rates. Some departments have high rates where others have low rates. Condition 2. Differences among products in the ratios of allocation-based usage within a department and across departments. Some products have a high ratio of allocation-based usage within departments, whereas other products have a low ratio of allocation-based usage within the same departments. To illustrate, Condition 1 exists for Ruiz because the factory overhead rate for the fabrication department is $100 per direct labor hour, whereas the rate for the assembly department is only $57 per direct labor hour. However, this condition by itself will not cause product cost distortions. So let's proceed to Condition 2. Condition 2 also exists for Ruiz. The snowmobile consists 8 direct labor hours in the fabrication department, whereas the riding mower consumes only 2 direct labor hours. Thus, the ratio of allocation-based usage is 4:1 in the fabrication department. In contrast, the ratio of allocation-based usage is 1:4 in the assembly department. Because both conditions exist for Ruiz, the product costs from using the single plant-wide factory overhead rate are distorted.